On with me now from 1070thefan.com, the great Kevin Bowen. Kevin, how you doing today, man?
Good. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, it's good to hear from you again, man. I know it's been kind of crazy, especially with the draft and all this craziness happening right now.
It's a good busy, though. Yeah, it is kind of one of the, probably honestly, the busiest part of the off season, but I enjoy it. It'll be fun next 10 days, although I might not say that this time tomorrow, but...
Yeah. How's the wife handle it when you're away for basically the entire weekend?
Yeah, she definitely doesn't love it, especially Sunday. You know, you kind of you miss Easter, and we got to do Easter tomorrow with my family, and luckily she'll be at a bachelorette party next weekend during the draft. But yeah, this weekend isn't great with Pacers. Just unfortunately playing Friday night and then Sunday afternoon as well.
Right. Yeah, this is craziness, but. Definitely stuff to look forward to when it starts to calm down a little bit in the summer where really there's nothing going on. So
couldn't agree with that more.
Yeah. So I thought what we should do would probably be good to just kind of go through the schedule a little bit. Okay. I know you guys will probably touch on this on your podcast, whether that's Tuesday, Thursday. And just kind of look through the games that you think the Colts should probably win. The games that'll be a little bit tougher than the games. I don't think there's really any games that they probably can't win, but I guess we can look at that too. We could just go from there. Just kind of dialogue.
That works for me. Yeah.
Well, we can just start in then. First off, the first game of the year at LA against the Chargers at 4:05 p.m. I think this one, as in contrast to last year's, this one's a little bit tougher opening game for the Colts going into 2019.
Yeah, Cody, I mean, I honestly think this is probably, even before the schedule came out, I thought this is one of the 3 or 4 toughest games on the entire slate. And with how big of an emphasis, Frank Reich has on the season opener, it is a huge, huge game. And you don't want to think, and I hate to do this, and I'll probably do it when we talk about Kansas City and a few games as well, but, there could be some serious playoff implications on the line. We don't think about it on September 8th, but, the Chargers and the Chiefs were knocking on the number 1 seed door, and Kansas City broke that door down, but the Chargers were right there as well, late last season. So this is a huge, huge game, not only from the standpoint of, you obviously want to start 1-0 and get off to a better start, but I fully expect the Chargers to be one of those teams that are in the, 3, 4, 5 teams talked about in the AFC. Here in 2019.
Exactly, and I think of the teams last year that were in the playoffs, the Chargers were probably, if not the most well-rounded, one of the most well-rounded teams in the league. And they didn't really lose a whole lot of pieces. They lost a few, and I think they're still going to continue to be that going into this year. They're definitely going to be one of those top teams, like you mentioned. So that'll be a tough game, I think, for the Colts to start, but. I think ultimately it'll be a good measuring stick for seeing the progress that the Colts have made in year 2. And so what better challenge than in week 1?
Yeah, and I think also, we talk about, and in general, you look at this entire schedule, quarterbacks are so much better here in 2019 on the opposing schedule than they were in 2018. You aren't going to find your Derek Andersons or your Cody Kesslers and, many of those here on this schedule. And even when you look at week 1, and that's a Hall of Fame quarterback, you're going to play right out of the gate. That's not Andy Dalton, who you opened up the season with last year.
Right.
So I think that's something where I always keep on thinking 11 wins, with this schedule seems really, really doable. But then I keep on thinking back to myself, wow, you aren't just going to have those games to where you're playing these quarterbacks who are strictly managers. Even when you look at a team like maybe Atlanta or Carolina, teams that didn't make the playoffs last year, weren't 500. They still have, Pro Bowl caliber quarterbacks that were both in the Super Bowl.
Right.
Within the last 3 or 4 years. So I think that's something just to keep in mind. This schedule is not going to be, anywhere near, cakewalk is probably too harsh a term to call last year's second part of the schedule, but it was very, very manageable from an opposing quarterback standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. So, what's your prediction for this game? I know we still have the draft, so it's very early. But what's kind of your early prediction?
Oh boy, man, you're putting me on the spot, Cody.
I know, it's okay. It's all right if you don't. It's okay. We have no idea what'll happen, but
no. I mean, if I were going to make a schedule, I'd probably pick the Chargers. Again, I think the Colts will win 11 games, and I think I've even said it before. On my podcast, the early part of the schedule I look at as something like, okay, can you get to that first bye week at 3-2? And then I think the rest of the schedule you can definitely get to like 11-5 or something like that. So to me, that would be a little bit of a split the road games, win 7 of your 8 home games. But like you said, I think the Chargers are really, really balanced. And that, to me, I think is one of the more complete teams in the AFC on both sides of the ball. I know they obviously got blown out of Foxborough last year in the divisional round, but, they won some big games last season. And, even winning in Baltimore in the first round, having to come cross-country was still pretty impressive to me. So I'll take the Chargers in this opener.
Yeah, and I think this will be a big game, I think, for Reich and company because, honestly, I was looking at, the last couple of years. I think the last time the Colts won a home or just an opener in general, was back, I think, a couple years ago against Oakland when they had Terrell Pryor as quarterback. So the Colts
2013.
Man.
It's crazy to think 2013. Yeah, I believe.
Wow.
I think it might have been Greg Toller had a big interception in that game.
Oh, my.
Or something along those lines. And yeah, it's been quite a while. That they've really, really struggled in the first quarter of the season. You hear coaches always break up quarters of the schedule. And I think in the first quarter, so the first 4 games each of the last 3 years, the Colts have gone 1-3. And that's why, they obviously sat outside of the playoffs 2 of those 3 seasons. And last year you had to get on a historic run, and still, you had to win a game in week 17 just to get in. So that's why I think it's so critical. When I look at the schedule, I honestly think that the toughest chunk is early in the season. And this opener, if you win this, there's a real possibility of being, maybe even 4-0 going into Kansas City week 5.
Yeah, definitely. And the next game on the schedule, I think what I want to do for these divisional games, the next game is being against the Tennessee Titans. What I want to do for these divisional games is we will just talk about them at one, and we can just skip over the other ones. So we'll start here with Tennessee. It's at Tennessee at 1 p.m., so the Colts will see Tennessee later on down the road. I think I believe it's actually the first day of December. The Colts will see Tennessee at home. They'll host Tennessee, and so I think we can say win for right now for the Colts because the Titans haven't proved otherwise that they can beat the Colts and beat Andrew Luck, and.
The number astonishes me every time, Cody. The fact that the Colts have beaten Tennessee 18 of their last 21 meetings.
Wow.
It's absurd. You don't see dominance like that in the NFL over one other opponent unless you're New England playing the AFC East. So it's just been incredible what Indianapolis has been able to do to Tennessee. Now, starting road is definitely not ideal. It's actually the first time since 2004 that the Colts have opened up week 1 and week 2 away from home. So that aspect of it, I think, is difficult. I do think Tennessee has a real chance to be a wild card team this season, but it's one of those things until Andrew Luck is still undefeated against the Titans, so
right.
I think you'd probably be a bit foolish, even on the road against a good football team, to pick against the Colts.
And at the same time, let's face it, even if Marcus Mariota gets hurt again, Ryan Tannehill's quite a lot better than Blaine Gabbert, so it's would be a little bit more of a challenge if Tannehill's healthy. That is.
Yeah, I was going to say, if Mariota's getting hurt week 1, we got some issues for the long term,
true.
2019 outlook for the Titans. But in all seriousness, I do like what Tennessee's done this offseason. Tannehill, I think, gives you much more of a just a sure thing as a backup quarterback, or at least, if Mariota has to miss 3 or 4 games, can Tannehill get you 500 in that stretch and keep those playoff hopes alive? But I really like the Adam Humphries signing. I still think Cameron Wake has good football left in him, even though he's really, really old.
Mm-hmm.
I think they signed Roger Saffold, I believe, as well. And they have a middle-round, first-round pick to help out that team. So I do think if you were looking on paper before the season started, at the Chargers, at the Titans to start the year, that's probably 2 of your 6 toughest games you're going to play all year.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. It's a very, very difficult first 2 games, especially when you look at, all the home games you got coming up after week 2.
Right, definitely. The next game on the schedule, at home, the Colts' first home game of the year, at 1 p.m. against the Atlanta Falcons, who Falcons had a down year last year. Let's not sugarcoat it. They were not a very good team. They were ravished by injuries last year, so they did not finish past 500, even at 500. The Falcons, despite their disappointing 2018 campaign, they're still a pretty talented team, Kevin.
Agreed. And, I go back to what we said at the start, Cody. It's like, look at their quarterback. That guy has been to a Super Bowl. He's played at a Pro Bowl level. They have a lot more talent than what their record was last season. And so I think this is a scary game because of that. And I guess when I say scary is just like, when you look at the home slate, of the 5 non-divisional games you play at Lucas Oil Stadium next season, none of those teams finished 500 or better last year.
Mm-hmm.
That alone makes you think, okay, 7-1 at home, right? But then it's like you start looking at some of the quarterbacks, and they are just better than decent players. So I think that is the concern with playing Atlanta after what you expect to be 2 very competitive games to start the season. It's not going to come back, and you aren't going to have some cakewalk against one of the bottom feeders of the NFL. Certainly with Julio Jones and Antonio Brown back-to-back weeks, you're going to face some pretty darn good wideouts in the month of September as well. But yeah, last year, Cody, the Colts didn't win a home game until what? I guess it would have been week 7 maybe?
Okay. Wow.
I think it was Buffalo. Yeah, I mean, you started 1-5. You had the bye week thrown in there. Your one win was at Washington. So it's absolutely pivotal. If we're going to talk about the Colts getting a bye week in the playoffs come January, anything short of 7 wins at home to me would be would probably eliminate, I think, a realistic chance of getting one of those buys.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of going back and touching on that point you were talking about, just about the good quarterbacks, and maybe not necessarily teams that were super talented last year or like good teams, but I think we saw it when, back in the Chuck Pagano, Ryan Grigson era even, like the Colts would win some games and pull off some games simply because Andrew Luck was magnificent. He was that good of a quarterback. And so I think that's a good point that you brought up. It's like, even though the Falcons weren't a playoff team last year, it's like they still have the quarterback that you have to be a little bit nervous about when you're playing.
And I think that's the hardest thing about playing the NFC South is you look at that division. It's probably, and I'm saying, I guess, a little bit of this off the top of my head, maybe the AFC North or the NFC North, would have something to say about it. Yeah. But, like, you look at the quarterbacks in that division, Breeze, Newton, Ryan. I mean, that's 3 of the more elite quarterbacks in this league. Obviously we can debate where Ryan and Newton would fall on that list, but those guys are a lot different than, let's say you're facing the AFC North or something like that, where it's like, okay, Baltimore's still really young with Lamar Jackson, Cincinnati, Andy Dalton needs to just hang it up, and then you're facing a young quarterback in Cleveland. Or, you look at the NFC East, and it's, where is Dak Prescott? Eli Manning probably needs to hang it up. Can Carson Wentz stay healthy? And who's going to be under center for the Redskins? So I just think that is probably the most difficult part about playing the NFC South. It's that you're going to get 3 really, I think, upper echelon quarterbacks, and then you still have Jameis Winston and Bruce Arians in early December.
Which you never know. I mean, Bruce Arians is...
Never.
Yeah, you just don't know with Jameis Winston and Bruce Arians. So, okay, the next game on the list, another home game. The Colts have back-to-back home games after their away starts. It's against the Oakland Raiders. I guess not Oakland anymore. LA. I always say Oakland.
Oakland.
At 1 p.m. Is it still Oakland?
For one more year.
Is it? Okay. I'm always confused because I'm like, it's like all these teams all of a sudden decided to move to LA, and now LA is going to have, or is it Vegas actually? It's Vegas Raiders, right?
The Vegas Raiders, but yeah, they will be in Oakland for one more year, and the Colts have played out in Oakland, 2 of the last 3 years, and now they'll get them in Indy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always confused about those teams over West. I'm just like, can never remember where they're at. But so they're playing Oakland still. Last year they went to Oakland, and it actually was surprisingly a very close game. And won out by Darius Leonard. Tomahawk chopping the ball out of Doug Martin's hands. Very impressive play. But I mean, the Raiders were in that game for a majority of the time, and I mean they were not a good team. Let's not sugarcoat it. They were not a good team last year. but they were competitive with the Colts throughout.
Yeah, I mean, that's a game that could have totally changed the whole complexion of the season. Think about that. I'm pretty sure that led into the Colts bye week, I want to say. If you lost that one, you lose a ton of momentum going into the bye week after just, dismantling Buffalo the week prior. But I'm really curious to see what Oakland looks like. They're such a fascinating team. On paper, they've got these 3 first-round picks next week. That'll be really interesting to see how they handle those. I think when you look at the close to this first quarter, Oakland is probably one of your easier games you're going to play all season long. But I still think with a Derek Carr and an Antonio Brown we saw last year, Carr had a big day against the Colts. I don't believe Malik Hooker played in that game. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. But when you look at what you have weeks 1 through 4, knowing what's coming up in week 5, you got to, I think, just try and find a way to go 3-1 in this stretch. And certainly that would mean must win over Oakland at home.
Speaking of Oakland, did you hear about Mayock and Gruden, what they did with their scouts? I just saw this.
I did.
Oh,
not sending them home. I mean, if I'm those scouts, you talk about being pissed. It's one that I was on the radio earlier on Friday, and I mentioned one thing, like, I can understand a general manager not wanting all of his scouts or a ton of scouts to be in the war room. I think it could get a bit cluttered. You could have a lot of voices and, do you have jobs assigned for everyone, handling trades and handling the board and stuff like that?
Right.
But to totally send them, they don't even feel like they're a part of the process. And I don't know. I feel like you work so hard for these 3 days and then go on your couch and watch it like you're, watching 90% of the NFL world consumes the draft. But nothing should shock us with Mayock and Gruden.
No, not at all. And it was just interesting because I'm like, can you even imagine if Chris Ballard and Frank Reich? I can never even have them thinking about that. It's wild to me, just the chaos that's in Oakland right now. The dysfunction is insane. Okay, we'll keep moving on here. So the next game, this is the start of the Colts. The Colts had 3 primetime games this year, all away, which I thought was really interesting. But this is the start of their slate. This is at Kansas City. This is that divisional rematch again at 8:20. And so, Kevin, this is a big game, a really big game. It's a redemption game potentially for the Colts.
Yeah, I think it's the biggest game on the schedule. You have some storylines with divisional playoffs last year and Justin Houston and those things. But I go back to what I said, about week 1 against the Chargers. I mean, this is a team that you could potentially be right there with at the end of the season, competing for one of the top seeds in the AFC. And I think there will come a time in 2019 where we talk about the Colts and we have this expectation for what they're going to be this season. And then I think that next question is going to be, can you beat elite quarterbacks and can you beat them on the road? Because that's what New England did to go to the Super Bowl. And I think that's what you have to have ultimately to be looked at as a viable championship team. So this is going to be a great game for, myriad of reasons. And let's be frank, you were blown off the field really in Arrowhead. You were, I didn't think the 31-13 final or whatever it ended up being was even that indicative of what the final score or just how the flow of that game really was. I think the Colts struggled mightily in that game to establish the run and try and stop Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. So this is going to be a really, really tough game for the Colts, and obviously will be a bit of a tone setter going into your bye week.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you were talking about something on your podcast. I believe it was Tuesday this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you were talking about how you were just puzzled, and I was too, how the Colts just kind of, they committed to the things that they were doing with Marlon Mack. I was really confused, and you were too, about where in the world, what happened to Nyheim Hines? I mean, this guy was critical early on for you in the passing game, and he just kind of disappeared, kind of got phased out of the game plan in those last couple games there.
Yeah, I kind of understood the Houston game when Mack is running it so well, but the Kansas City game was a bit of a head scratcher, especially when you're struggling early on.
Yeah,
and it's once you abandon the run game, I felt like using Hines as more of that guy that at least makes the opposing defensive coordinator think on a Tuesday night, okay, where's he going to line up? Like, that guy can be a bit of a game changer for you, or at least can just affect, how an opposing defense lines up. So That is what Kansas City has. They have unique offensive weapons, and I think the Colts need to continue to add to that next week at the receiver position. But that game, that should be highly, highly anticipated for a guy like Justin Houston. Thinking that he got cut by the team that drafted him, and now he goes back to Arrowhead and is in that environment, and he tries to get one game further. So that is going to be, I think, one of the favorite games, bar none, of the 2019 schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the Colts actually have their bye week after that. Only 6 games in, the Colts have the bye week a little bit early. I think it was one of the earlier ones they've had in the last couple years. So, Kevin, a couple questions with this bye week. First off, what does it do for the Colts? They had such an early bye week, and also what kind of, I guess, record do you think they should be looking at having going into the bye?
Well, it is early. Earliest since 2012, and I think about 98% of NFL people would hate having a Week 6 bye. Now, if there is, I guess, a good part of it, it does come between sandwich 2 of your bigger games of the year at Kansas City, and then home to Houston out of your bye. I would think anything at 3-2 would be the mark that I think sets you up for, you got 4 out of your next 5 at home coming out of the bye week. So, if you can go 3-2, I see no reason why you can't go 4-1 your next 5 coming out of the bye. Boom, that puts you at 7-3, I think, going into the last 6 games of the year. So I think that you want to be above 500, because then you just put a lot of pressure on yourself coming out of the bye week if you're not. So I'll say a 3-2 mark would be really, really good for this team going into what I think is just a bye week that you don't love having it early in mid-October.
Yeah, definitely. And then the next game, like you mentioned, versus Houston at home, 1 p.m., the first start of their 2 games with Houston. And, last year this was a battle all the way to the end. The Colts, they played Houston first. They lost at home in overtime in that famous 4th down call that we all have heard about 1,000 times. And then they went on the road twice and beat Houston. And so I guess my question, Kevin, what are the storylines heading into this game?
Well, I think a lot of it is just how does Houston react to losing 2, huge games at home to the Colts late last season. Maybe that first game didn't really matter as much because they still felt like, they probably were going to win the division. They weren't going to get a bye. But, really at the time, I think they were still in the race for the bye. But that wild card loss had to sting. And that was a game that I thought Indianapolis really did a nice job of controlling, physically imposing their will and ultimately winning. So, what does Houston do in the secondary? What do they do in their offensive line next week during the draft? It is a little odd that, the Colts will have 2 weeks to prepare for this Week 7 game against Houston. And then when you face them in Week 12, you got about 4 or 5 days to get ready. That's a Thursday nighter down there in Houston. This was the only game I thought on the home schedule that I thought had a chance of being prime time. I know a lot of people are really frustrated about the lack of home primetime games. Outside of playing Houston at home on a Thursday night, I don't know what TV people would want, off that Colts home schedule. I was a staunch believer in thinking Kansas City and New Orleans are no-brainers, and unfortunately for the Colts, those games are on the road. But nothing else on the home slate outside of this one did I think had a realistic chance of being a primetime game.
Yeah, exactly. And we know how poor the Colts started off last time against Houston at home, and they definitely cannot afford to do that again, especially with elite pass rushers like Jadeveon Clowney and J.J. Watt, trying to get to the backfield and trying to get to Andrew Luck. And so, yeah, Kevin, I think that's a big game, and I think that's an interesting thing that you pointed out I hadn't really thought of, is like the Colts are going to have a couple weeks to look at Houston, and maybe they're going to have to do a lot of their homework then, for sure, since they have that Thursday night game. Okay, so we can move on now to the next game, still a home game, against the Denver Broncos, 4:25. So I think this is the first game. Last year the Colts had all their home games at 1 o'clock. This is their first 4:25 home game of the year.
Yeah, they got a couple 4 o'clockers in there this season at home. So CBS, I think, wanted the appeal of having Andrew Luck in more of a prime slot for them because they don't have any night packages anymore with Fox and NFL Network getting Thursday night. But obviously, who's going to be Denver's quarterback? I think that's the biggest storyline, especially Week 8. Do we see them at that point turn to a rookie? Do they make some pick next week? And it's really, I guess off the top of my head, maybe Dan Quinn in Atlanta, but it's probably one of the more defensive-minded head coaches in the league with Vic Fangio taking over. You are going to see Bradley Chubb and Von Miller in that game, so it'd be paramount to get out to an early lead and just make sure that those elite rushers, or one of the better tandems in the league, aren't able to kind of pin their ears back with a lead.
Yeah, definitely. And then the next game on the schedule against Joey's Steelers, start of November, November 3rd at 1 p.m. The Steelers, Kevin, they've gone through a lot of turmoil, and with losing Antonio Brown, that whole drama saga, and the Le'Veon Bell situation last year, and so they've got a lot of talent that they lost, but they're still a very talented team.
They are. So. I mean, I think that's what we kind of forget. It's like James Conner filled in really well, and Juju Smith-Schuster was a Pro Bowler, and this is still a pretty good roster. So we know the Colts have been absolutely waxed, by the Steelers in the past 4 or 5 years. I think the number is 4 straight losses by an average of 19 points per game, which is really beyond embarrassing, to be honest with you. And so, I know that there's been a lot of turnover, coaching staffs and roster, coaching staff in Indy and roster mainly, I guess in Indy as well. But that should be a game that a bit of a chip on your shoulder. And if you can go in there and win that game, that sets up the potential to really get on a run with the 4 home games sandwiched around it. This is the stretch you have 4 or 5 at home. And, outside of this game, you won't face really an inclement weather game the rest of the season. Maybe you get some rain in one of those Florida games. Excuse me. But if you look at the final 4 road games after Pittsburgh, you're inside in Houston, you're in Florida at Tampa Bay, you're inside against New Orleans, and then you close the year out down in Jacksonville. So 2 Florida games and two dome games, really, after this Pittsburgh game in early November.
Yeah, definitely. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. Okay, the next game. This is a very intriguing game to me because of what happened last year. I was actually at this game last year. Colts are playing Miami at home again. This year, Miami, man, they had a lot of changes in this offseason. Losing Ryan Tannehill, obviously, is the biggest one. Getting a new coach is obviously big. So these Dolphins might look a lot different than they did when the Colts faced them in 2018.
They will. That was, really, really competitive game. That was a game Jack Doyle got hurt in. Marlon Mack, I think, suffered a concussion late in that game as well. I don't expect Miami to be, as good as they were last year, hanging around that wild card door for quite a while. I will be curious, just like Denver 2 weeks earlier, who is the starting quarterback at this point of the season? Is it really going to be Ryan Fitzpatrick? Don't know a whole lot about Brian Flores and the whole New England tree that Bill Belichick, former coaches have not had great success moving away from him. So I would say on paper, this is probably right up there with Oakland as one of the more easier is never really a good word to describe an NFL game, but it's certainly a game you expect to win.
Yeah,
sitting here right now.
Definitely. Okay, so the Colts also play Jacksonville at home, and they'll play them later on the season finale down in Jacksonville. And they split last year with Jacksonville, despite Jacksonville's less than stellar season, shall we say. They still were very competitive both games with Jacksonville.
They were. Jacksonville is still a really, really talented football team on the defensive side. So this is if this is the 4th best team in your division, it's a pretty talented 4th best team.
Yeah.
And I think that's what worries you just in general about the AFC South, which is right up there with any other division in terms of parity and just their competitiveness from 1 to 4. You would like to think you're getting into the stretch here with 3 divisional games in 14 days. You have Jacksonville, then you go to Houston on a Thursday night, then you have your mini bye weekend, play your second game against the Titans to start the month of December. This I think will be a huge, huge stretch and just deciding what the AFC South outlook for Indianapolis looks like, come the final few weeks of the season.
Yeah, definitely. And, we definitely can't talk about Jacksonville without talking about their quarterback situation. And now, on paper at least, they have a lot better quarterback than they did with Blake Bortles in 2018.
They do, yeah. We'll see if the Nick Foles magic can carry over to the regular season for them. But yeah, it's something where they don't need to ask their quarterback to do too much. Given, where's Leonard Fournette at? I think that's a big question as well. But considering what their defense is, if that defense can get back to being, half the unit the Colts saw late in the season, I think that this is a team that could be that surprise 8-win team, 9-win team in the AFC. I don't expect them to be like that, but if Foles can inject some life into them, they very well could be.
Yeah, definitely. And then, like you mentioned, the Colts, they go to Houston for another primetime game. They're back home against Tennessee. And then the next 3 games are actually against all NFC South opponents. They're traveling to 2 with Tampa Bay at 1, New Orleans at 8:15, and then Carolina at 1 p.m. So we'll start there. We're going to Tampa against Bruce Arians, formerly as of the Colts back in 2012, the offensive coordinator, then the interim head coach when Chuck Pagano obviously had cancer. And so what could the Colts be expecting with a Bruce Arians led squad in Tampa Bay?
Well, they're going to chuck it, and it sounds like he believes in Jameis Winston as well. So it looks like that's going to be the quarterback the Colts will see in Week 14. This stretch for me, Cody, is probably the second toughest of the schedule. When you talk about at Tampa Bay, at New Orleans, home to Carolina, and then at Jacksonville, you've lost 3 straight in Jacksonville. Right. And so I think 3 of your last 4 on the road, and then, again, you're playing a pretty competent quarterback at home with Cam Newton. So Tampa would be the one that I think you feel like that you really, really need to get. And so that's something, first-year head coach, a quarterback that desperately needs a good season to secure that second contract in Tampa Bay. This will be a game coming out of the bye week coming out of those 3 straight AFC South games we won't talk a lot about, but this could set up, one way or the other, a very, very critical, 4-game stretch to end the season.
Exactly. And then they're traveling to New Orleans. I believe it's the 10-year celebration of when the Colts and the Saints met in the Super Bowl back in 2009. And so Saints are also a very, very well-rounded team, similar to the Chargers. On paper, they really don't have a whole lot of weaknesses. And so what do the Colts have to do in order to stay competitive and possibly beat the Saints?
Well, I would say, can you get after Drew Brees and just kind of get him off his spot? I think defending Alvin Kamara is also another big storyline. The dynamic nature to his game and how impactful he can be out of the backfield. And as a runner, it'll be interesting to see just how his snaps and his touches get divided up with Mark Ingram now in Baltimore. But, this is right up there with Kansas City. As that other very, very highly anticipated game for the Colts in 2019, when you look at kind of that measuring stick sort of game. It's not going to have huge implications on home field in terms of the head-to-head, but you could be in the mix. And also, if you lose to Kansas City in Week 5, New Orleans is a team. If you want to have Super Bowl aspirations, the 10-year anniversary, it might lead to 2 teams playing the Super Bowl. Right. Something along those lines. So this is going to be a really, really fun game down there in the Superdome.
Yeah, it always seems like there's fireworks happening in the Superdome. Something dramatic always happens. So that'll be a very, very cool and fun game to be at. Okay, so the final game, besides the Jacksonville game, is back home, the Colts' home finale against the Carolina Panthers. And this is something that you talked about. You talked about Cam Newton, but will the Panthers have Cam Newton in 2019?
Yeah, that is, I would say, one of the bigger injury questions regarding quarterbacks here in 2019 around the league. It sounds like they're much more optimistic than the Colts were, this time 2 years ago with Andrew Luck in that situation. But anytime it's a throwing quarterback who, or a throwing shoulder injury, that's something that you have to look at and think to yourself, well, they kind of shut him down late last season. Would they do the same if they're out of contention come late December here in 2019. But having said that, I think it's very similar to the first chunk of the schedule when you feel like one of your easier games is against Atlanta. Well, Matt Ryan can still sling it a little bit, and now you come here and it's like, okay, you have 3 or 4 on the road in the year. Well, you think Carolina is probably your easiest game considering it's at home, but Cam Newton has played at an MVP level before. So that is probably the difficulty that I see in this game. Of it. It's a bit of a trap game in that it is the only home game down the stretch, but it also comes against a very difficult matchup, or just a very unique matchup at the quarterback position.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Kevin, before I let you go, I wanted to do something. I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll give you a second to think about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through the schedule really fast and kind of say if I think the Colts will win this game or lose this game, and that'll kind of determine what I think their record will be in 2018. Obviously, it's way too early, but just kind of do this for fun. And so I'll start it off here with the Chargers. I think that will be a loss as well. I think the Colts will, unfortunately, not break that trend of losing their first game of the year. So I think that's a loss. I think Tennessee will be a win. I think the Colts will win Tennessee, Atlanta, and then Oakland. I think they'll win those. They'll be 3-1, and then they'll probably be competitive with Kansas City. But it's so hard to win at Arrowhead. So I think the Colts will probably drop that one. At home versus Houston, I think the Colts will win that, and Denver. I think they'll probably, unfortunately. No, I'm going to go with a win in Pittsburgh. And then they'll win their next 2 games against Miami and Jacksonville. I think they'll go to Houston again for the 3rd time in however short amount of period of time. They'll beat Houston on prime time. Andrew Luck's never lost to Tennessee. He'll beat Tennessee again. I think they'll beat Tampa, and then I think this is where it'll get a little bit tougher, and this will be interesting to see if this does happen, how the Colts will handle it when they go to the playoffs. I think they will drop one in New Orleans because the Superdome is insane and very loud and hard to win in. I think they'll beat Carolina at home, and then I think, unfortunately, with the Jacksonville. They'll probably drop one to Jacksonville. And so 12-4 is my final prediction. Do you kind of have your idea of where you think they'll land? I know you mentioned it earlier, but...
Yeah, I think something. I would guess I go with 11-5. I look at that 3 divisional game stretch in November and December of home to Jacksonville, at Houston on a short week, and then Tennessee after that. That I think will be really, really pivotal to this team winning the division here in 2019, especially that short week against Houston. But yeah, I think something right around 11 wins seems very, very reasonable for this football team. I think it's nice you have the spaced out of the big game against Kansas City early in the year, the big game against New Orleans late in the year.
Oh yeah,
there is that soft spot in the middle of the schedule. Whereas besides at Pittsburgh, you're probably going to be favored in 80-90% of those games coming out of the bye week, all the way into, possibly even that New Orleans game in week 15. So that is your opportunity, I think, to find some success. But I go back to what I said earlier. I mean, if you look at the quarterback questions on this schedule, Denver, Miami, I guess that's it, I mean, like, Jacksonville has Nick Foles now. Like, Tampa's at least going to try the Jameis Winston, thing for another year. Outside of that, you don't really have many quarterback questions for a lot of these teams. Yeah, Oakland, isn't maybe 100% sold on the future of Derek Carr, but they at least know what their starter is going to look like unless they do something crazy next week. So that, to me, is just the only question of, all right, can this defense, continue to perform at a better than median sort of level like they did last year against much better quarterback play.
Yeah, for sure. Kevin, what you working on?
So obviously a lot of draft coverage stuff on 1070thefan.com. I posted 3 different things this week on looking at what, in my opinion, the 3 biggest needs position-wise: pass rush, wide receiver, and then secondary. And then I also posted a positional mock draft on Thursday. So that's just strictly off positions, not talking about, players and depth in the draft or anything like that. I'm just going off of, give me the Colts roster. Where do I think the biggest needs are and kind of weigh those, in terms of where each pick lies for the Colts as they have 9 picks going into Thursday. So that time of year, Cody, I'm really, really excited for next week. And it'll be fun here in the next couple of weeks breaking down what these 9 or maybe more, maybe less draft picks look like for the Colts.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be an exciting week, Kevin. We can find you on Twitter, on Instagram at kbowen1070, and then also at 1070thefan.com. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate your time, man, and I hope you have a great draft week.